So welcome everyone. My name is Jenny Kurzweil. I serve as the Director of Communications and Marketing for SACNAS. We're really grateful that you took the time today to attend this call. We will record this call and have it available on our website for streaming. We'll get started. So a few brief instructions will be to please put yourself on mute and turn your video camera off. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the session, so you can use the chat function to type in your questions. But we find that muting helps with the background noise and any kind of feedback.
I brushed my hair and got all cleaned up to be on video today.
Well, we'll put you on video, Mark. Great. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to use the chat button, and we'll be monitoring that. So we'll get started. The first thing I want to talk to you about is just the background on California AB 1887, which most of you know, but in case you don't, California issued this travel ban for all state employees, officers, members, including students at UCs, CSUs, and community colleges, to refrain from using public funds to travel to 7 states, including Texas. This ban for Texas in particular was issued as a response to an anti-LGBT law that came in, and so California was boycotting the state for that reason. AB 1887 may affect students, staff, and faculty from California state-funded colleges and universities who wish to attend 2018 SACNAS using school or California-based grant funding. But there are several exceptions to this ban. Primarily the clause, the law does not apply to travel that is required to participate in meetings or trainings required by a grant or required to maintain funding. It does not apply to travel funded by federal grants or private money, and it does not impact private institutions or prohibit California students applying for SACNAS-sponsored travel scholarships. And we'll unpack that as we go into the agenda, but that's the overview. I wanted to give you all a little reasoning as to why we are staying in Texas despite the travel ban. So actually the decision to stay in Texas had nothing to do with the travel ban, which emerged simultaneously alongside the legislation that was Texas-based. It's SB 4, which is actually an anti-sanctuary cities bill, which was widely opposed and actually has been stalemated in the Texas Supreme Court. But it was a very challenging spring for Texans, specifically the large Hispanic and Latino populations there, as the SB 4 had to do with mandated partnerships between local law enforcement and ICE agency. So the board decided to stand in solidarity with Texas and those who opposed the bill because Texas has the second largest Hispanic population and it houses 10% of our 115 SACNAS chapters. In addition to standing with solidarity with our Texas community, the SACNAS 2018 contracts were signed over 5 years ago with San Antonio, and so breaking those contracts was cost prohibitive. So while we are challenged by the travel ban with California and Texas, this was the reasoning behind our decision. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We are very happy to have Dr. Mark Lawson on the call. And Mark, would you please introduce yourself?
I will. Hello, everyone. So I'm just on background, I'm a professor in reproductive, well, we just changed our department name, I'm still getting it out, obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive sciences, or OGRS for short. aside from my duties as a postdoctoral training director, both at the UC San Diego campus and then at the UC level for the President's Fellowship Program, I also co-direct an IMSD program. So those of you not familiar, that's an NIH-funded undergraduate training program for biomedical science career support. And I have also had other various training programs that have been nationwide in scope, and have worked a lot with both Hispanic and historically Black colleges and universities. And so I have a lot of background in undergraduate STEM research and career promotion, also at the graduate level, although currently my expertise is in postdocs. But I work quite a lot with NIH and NIH funded and NSF. I do a lot of work with them as well. And so I think I have a good base of knowledge for you guys to draw on for any questions you might have about navigating national meetings that fall under the auspices of the AB 1887. I do want to add real quick, Jenny, I don't know if you had a chance to see the news in the last day or so, but SB 4 has actually been upheld by the Texas Supreme Court as constitutional. So that's in effect, actually. So that's the breaking news. So that's partly, the motivation, as Jenny described, for maintaining a presence in Texas is to support that community and have a forum to voice, opinion and support for the community there. So, but just in case you were wondering, it is upheld, so it is the law of Texas now.
Thank you very much for that information, Mark. It's so hard to keep up with the news these days, so I will make sure to do some research on that and then inform our Texas constituents accordingly. Yeah. And we'll make sure to provide information and resources for the entire SACNAS community about that. I'd also like to introduce Eric Carrillo.
Hello, I'm a program associate here at SACNAS. My main responsibility here is managing the travel scholarships. So I did want to share that our travel scholarships applications are currently open. They'll be available until April 13th for undergraduate and graduate students. The travel scholarship does cover round-trip flight to San Antonio, and it also covers the lodging for the duration of the conference. So if there's any students who are interested in attending our conference, I highly encourage you to apply for the travel scholarship. The other major expense that you would be responsible for is for the conference registration. But because the conference registration itself isn't actually covered by this band, that is something that some of the institutions could potentially cover. But that is something that you would have to do a little bit more research because that would depend on your institution itself. Because again, because the travel scholarship would cover the travel part of it and the lodging part, we definitely highly encourage you to apply for the travel scholarships.
Great, thank you, Eric. So we also have on hand our sponsorship and exhibits manager, Kristin Goody, who will be available specifically around the question and answer period.
Good morning. My name is Kristin Goody. I am the sponsorship and exhibits manager, and I am here to help guide all exhibitors and sponsors through possible other options other than using state funds or using funds that go directly to SACNAS, which is in Santa Cruz, California, and not Texas.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Mark, can you take it away here in terms of advice and strategies for students in particular?
So, programs like Mark and Rise, any sort of undergraduate program like IMSD, which is a federally funded NIH program. AGEP includes NSF type funded programs. Anything funded from the Department of Energy or any federal agency that's supporting students are not subject to the funding rules of the AB 1887. And that's because that's California law, that's not federal law, right? So federal law, federal travel under funds that come from the federal government are above and in essence supersede state restrictions, mainly for the reason that they can't, keep track of 50 different states' laws, and so that's why the federal government doesn't get involved in those things. Those are state matters. So you should not have any difficulty in using undergraduate research or travel money for costs toward attending SACNAS in Texas or any other events in any of the states that are listed under under that prescription by the government of California. So as far as travel funds from those grants, Marks, RISE, IMSD, AGEP, you should not have any problems, and be clear that if anybody tells you that there are problems, you remind them that those are federally funded programs, and they're not subject to that. And that's even, as Jenny pointed out, exclusively mentioned in the bill itself. Now, if you need other funds to attend, because obviously it won't cover everything, then that gets into the question of whether those funds that you're using are state funds or not. And so there are categories of funding that are accessible, although different institutions have different access to them and different amounts of them. And this is challenging, particularly in the Cal States, and those are unrestricted or non-state funds. So these are funds that come from things like alumni associations, from private donor support, corporate donations, or programs that also support STEM education and attendance at meetings. Those things are not. Those things are also not subject to the 1887's prescriptions. So if you're in a program, say if you're in a partnership with, a company, like say you're an engineer and you're working with Lockheed, in some project, and Lockheed is helping support you to attend SACNAS, that's not subject to state funding. So only funds that come from the state general fund are subject to this restriction. And so those are what, so that's what restricted and unrestricted means, is directly state funds. So how you get access to those is going to be different in every environment. Normally students, are encouraged to approach their department chairs in the major that they're in, or in whoever's lab or other format that they're working in, to contact chairs and deans of the schools and say, look, I'm presenting research at a scientific conference. Are there funds that can help me attend? And usually they'll, provide some small amount of money towards that. That money has to come from an unrestricted source, and that's where the definition will be. And they may say, well, we'd love to, but we can't because the money's restricted. Then you bring the question, well, do you have unrestricted funds? As a matter of, as example, our physical sciences department at UC San Diego has a very strong alumni association, and they actually for years have sent the physical sciences students that want to go to SACNAS, and it's purely an alumni association activity. It's not a state-funded activity or anything like that. So they've never concerned themselves with these types of activities, and they will not in the future. But so it really takes a little bit of digging and a little bit of asking. And the other thing, the fundraisers also help, and those will cover some of the costs and help defray. Between small amounts of money through fundraisers, campus funds. Now, a SACNAS chapter that gets money from the school cannot use those funds because they're likely to be state funds generated. But there may be some distinguishment between money that comes from student fees versus money that comes directly from the state budget. And those are questions that need to be asked. So I think that basically covers the student strategies.
It does, Mark. Thank you. I did want to point out a question that we received prior to the webinar too, which was, the question was, how do faculty or students provide guidance to the folks in the business and finance offices so that they are not worried that they are not following the travel ban? And on our website, under the attendees tab, we have legislation updates. You can go there to find out full information about AB 1887, and then it also has a link to the actual legislation. In there, it very clearly states the exception for federal grant monies. So if people are having a hard time explaining to their business and finance office about that, you literally would just need to print out the law, highlight that section, and assure them that this is within the parameters of the legislation. And I also want to reiterate Mark's point about the difference between restricted and unrestricted funds. So I think that that's a really important opportunity for students and faculty looking at this challenge. We'll go directly next to advice for faculty and program directors. Mark?
So, for program directors, because generally your support is derived from those grants and programs, those are federal grants and you can use them, and they have the added burden that in order for, because quite often, and most of us do, write into these proposals that you will be sending students and supervising them at SACNAS. So these actually fall under the additional exception that to maintain and or renew your grant, you need to be engaged in these activities, and because of that, that also falls under that exception. And you know, of course, there's potential for argument and pushback about that, but because it's generally that support is very easily traced back directly to that federal grant, that's important. The one bit of additional information that that I'd like to add. So in that case, there's the additional thing is if you're curious about what the federal government has to say about things, is that federal travel policies, NIH follows the General Services Administration travel policies. So they don't have their own policies, they just use the GSA. The GSA travel policies are all under the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 300. So CFR 300, you might have people that say something about that. And the federal government is silent on these issues, again, for the reason that the federal government cannot keep up with 50 states' different laws passed at different times. So because they're federal, they have to have a more generalized approach. So they are silent on these issues because that is exclusively a state a state purview as far as what state funds are doing, but federal funds bear no restrictions like that. All their policies are listed under that Code of Federal Regulations, and there's no individual restrictive policies about travel. So there's an additional, tool in the toolkit, I guess, for addressing those concerns if they're brought up.
Thank you, Mark. Any ideas for any faculty or staff or program directors that aren't federally funded that have been going to SACNAS?
Yeah, well, that's the difficult one. That comes back to how funds might be distributed. If there is research grant money involved, and if the faculty get a share of overhead return to their lab, or a share of FTE savings that are generated out of federal grant support, then those funds are federal funds, and so they're not under that. So there's ways of doing that. If you've been entirely dependent on institutional funds, then one of the things to inquire about, one of the things that's done at UC, although we have different tools available to us, is that our chancellor funds these activities out of what are called opportunity funds. And these are funds that they're generated outside the context of the state direct budget for funding undergraduate education. They are, the other name they're called strategic funds or opportunity funds. They'll be called private funds or advancement funds. They're funds from donors. Those are the kinds of sources that you can approach, deans, chairs, and eventually, presidents and chancellors about for having access to or working out cost savings or cost sharing swaps of funds within the flexibility of the funds themselves in order to free up unrestricted funds and use those in provision, so that the budget isn't essentially impacted, but that the funds become accessible. And those examples would be using, in a legitimate way, a state-derived fund for supporting some activity in the college or school that frees up something that's normally used by advancement or unrestricted funds or private donor funds. So those are the basic general strategies, is to kind of be creative about it. It does require, pushing a little bit on the system, but they are accessible, and at least our experience with it is that's been possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark. Lastly, we're going to look at advice for exhibitors, advice and strategies for exhibitors in particular. Mark, do you mind speaking to this for a moment as well?
Yeah, so this comes right out of what I just mentioned regarding the use of advancement or other funds to support exhibition. It's been a general practice on some of our campuses that the chancellors use, or the equivalent of the presidents, use these advancement, private donor, or other derived funds that come from overhead from federal grants to support exhibiting at the conference. But there's something in additional to that you should be aware of, is that exhibition fees and those things are to SACNAS. They're billed by SACNAS, which is a California corporation, and they come through SACNAS. So all the PO and all of the monetary exchange and all of that occurs within the state. That's a state-in-state transaction. And so because these things are tracked by who's getting the money and where is the money going, that should not be scrutinized with respect to the travel ban, because those are essentially business transactions between SACNAS and the institution, and that's all internal California billing. So hopefully that'll get to your, oh, and the other thing is attendance and supporting attendees, that third point down on the slide that Jenny has. Now, our overall practice that we've encouraged through the years, which is, I think, a good best practice anyway, is that we use postdocs and graduate students as our staffing at booths. Occasionally, we have a reduced complement of staff, essentially the minimal needed just to support getting to the conference, getting things set up at the exhibition, and breaking it down. But all of the staffing is done generally by graduate students and postdocs. Now, the CSUs have less access to that because they're fewer in number. But certainly using student staff that are supported on the federal funds or other outside funds can help alleviate the manpower issue that some may experience in that. And that's what we do that normally anyway. We'll send 1 or 2 staff, and then the rest are all graduate students and postdocs, and even undergraduates that are senior do the booth manning, mainly because they're the best advocates for your program. If they're not doing a good job of selling, then you're not running your program well.
That's right. Well, thank you. So we're gonna move to the question and answer period. So please ask questions via the chat function, and as soon as you move your mouse, you'll see the options on the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat icon and type in your question. If you have a question specifically for Eric, Kristin, or Mark, you can direct it that way and ask away. I do have one question that came in before, so as people are typing in, we can ask this. This is particularly for Eric. Will there be a commitment to more travel scholarships, particularly to support students from California institutions?
So we are looking to try to expand our funding to try to incorporate more students. But I do want to reiterate that I think part of the travel scholarship that it covers the travel and lodging. I also want to really highlight what Mark brought up earlier about unrestricted funds, because really the big expense that's not currently covered by the travel scholarship is the registration cost. And I believe that is something that institutions, if they do have those unrestricted funds, students could utilize that to help them cover those costs as well.
Great, thank you, Eric. We have a question that came in. Do build programs funded by NIH fall under the same category as MARC and RISE?
And the answer to that is yes. So those are still federally funded programs and build funds used at the very, I think it's mainly what Long Beach and Northridge can be used for this type of activity. And so they're the same. They are treated the same as other federal funds.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming today. And I want to assure you that we are here all the time. So you can visit 2018sacnas.org, email info@sacnas.org, or call us to ask any questions you may have as you're exploring these options and looking for support. We'll also be downloading this recording and putting it on our 2018 SACNAS website so that you can revisit any of the information that Mark provided and pass it on to your colleagues and peers. So Mark, I want to thank you very much for your time today and expertise. So with that, thank you. Thank you for being SACNistas, and we hope to see you in San Antonio. Have a great day, everyone.